participants, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It is my pleasure to be a moderator of today. My name is Rosalina Méndez, and on behalf of the social platform Venezolanos Unidos en Holanda, I would like to welcome you all to the Forum Venezuela, the current crisis leading to a new democracy. So I would like to talk about a little bit about Venezuela, Venezolanos Unidos en Holanda. For those of you that don't know who we are, it is a social civil platform committed to support Venezuelan citizens in the Netherlands and intending to be the voice inside and outside the territory. We consider democracy as an important value in any society and the right of voting a fundamental pillar to sustain transparent democratic governments, always respecting equality, freedom, and in political, religious, and social activities. And there is something special for me to say that I think that most of the time images can speak by itself, and words can create awareness from a reality that might be a little bit far away from our residents, far away. And both of them, images and great speakers today, are part of our program. But due to personal reasons, one of our speakers might not be able to join us today, but he was very kind to send us his material collected in Venezuela the last April 2017. And I would like to show us now. The journalist who visited Venezuela is Michiel Specker, and he's a very special journalist because he says that he likes to be in the right place, at the right place and in the wrong time. So thanks to Michiel for sending the images. And we will continue with our program. In that case, we will have our first guest speaker. He has a PhD in political science from Harvard University, specialized in the politics of economy and social policy reform in Latin America. His research focuses on democratization and political economy of development. His work on Latin America has focused on presidential power, political parties, economy reforms, international relations, and sexuality. He has published extensively on Venezuela, Cuba, and Argentina. He has also been a consultant for the World Bank the United Nations, the Center for Global Development, Freedom House, and the American Academy of Arts and Science. And please join me to welcome Dr. Javier Corrales.
Yes. Okay.
We don't have microphone. I think that the room isn't enough for me
Okay.
to.
So I'll just stand because I'm short, and I'll just feel closer to you. And I do have a PowerPoint. Thank you so much. This is a nice treat. Do you want me to go over there, or
I'd be happy to do it.
I can do it?
That's okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
so you don't feel
Whatever.
the yeah. So let me just
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe it goes.
I can just leave it here, and then all I have to do is do that. Yeah, but then I have to make sure I don't stand in front of it. So if why don't I go over here?
Yeah.
If I stand here, you can all see me and hear me? Okay. Great. Well, well, why don't we get to the first slide? But thank you very much for this kind invitation. It was kind of coincidental. I think I'm here at the right place at the right time. I'm visiting Holland for just 2 months, and the moment I heard that you were organizing this, I said, sure. I always like to share with folks the work that I do on Venezuela as a political scientist, as a professor. And I want to share with you a presentation I gave a few days ago at Leiden University and even at the University of Amsterdam, which is where I'm teaching a course this semester. But before I get started with my academic, I want to say, since this is an organization of Venezuelans mostly, although I know that there's some here who are not Venezuelan, that it's killing me what I'm seeing in Venezuela on the one hand. On the other hand, what I'm seeing in Venezuela is mesmerizing me. It's filling me with enormous hope to see the Venezuelan people rise the way that they have and confront this incredible problem that they face from the government, and to do it with the strength that they're doing it. I don't know what's going to be the outcome, but I come from a Cuban family. Cuba had its resistance for about 4 years into the Castro administration, 5 years, and then it disappeared. It was completely demolished. And to see that Venezuela is not giving up really fills me with hope. So it kills me on the one hand because the country's suffering the way it is, but at the same time, I find admirable what's going on. All right, so that was just my personal note on Venezuela. Let me do a bit of an analysis. And what I want to discuss is the question that's in everyone's mind, I think. How come this government hasn't fallen? What is keeping the government in place? And I will begin by saying that I'm going to give you this analysis, but the most important point, the answer is the government isn't falling because the government has turned incredibly autocratic. And we know in political science that authoritarian regimes can survive this and worse crisis. They can fall, but they also have mechanisms for survival that we do not see available to democracies. And I want to talk about some of these mechanisms that the government has deployed and illustrate why many of these survival mechanisms that the government has deployed are, number one, non-democratic. I hope there's no doubt about it when I'm done. But also why the government is able to gain some life. So first, let's just quickly take a look at a chart showing Venezuela's evolution over the years. Some of you might be familiar with this, but this is an index of the extent to which a country is democratic. It goes from 0 to 1. 1 is pretty awesome. Nobody's there really, but being in this area is still considered pretty awesome. And here's Venezuela. Venezuela was a remarkable case because it established democracy for global South standards very early on and very high, and maintained a significant degree of continuity over the years until Chavez arrived. And then you see this process called backsliding. The other two candidates from Latin America that could qualify would be Ecuador under Correa or Bolivia under Evo Morales, but these cases were not as democratic as Venezuela was, and they really haven't regressed as much. Venezuela is now a world-famous case for an extreme form of what is called democratic backsliding. There are very few examples of this drop. There are drops, but they're never this steep. And here's another Freedom House, which was mentioned, makes a classification of countries based on whether they're free, partly free, or not free. And this is the most recent ranking. Venezuela, for the first time, acquired the purple color. It used to be under Chavez with this color, but it has now been declared by this organization as officially a dictator. Let me just say, I spent a lot of my time academically discussing political regime during the Chavez era, and there was so much polarization. Some people say it's democratic, it's participatory, and some people saying it's not. We've moved past that. We're now at a point of, I think there are very, very, very few serious analysts who would dispute the fact that the democracy has pretty much, minimal democracy has pretty much ended in Venezuela. Now, what I'm going to do is I want to compare the situation in Venezuela with other presidencies that have collapsed in Latin America, so that we can understand the kind of pressures that the regime is having, and then do an analysis of how come Venezuela has, Maduro has survived it. These are all the presidents since 1984 who have left office prematurely. It's a good list of 20. Fewer than was typical during the Cold War era, but still, you know, this is not a small number. And I don't want to give you too much on that, but they all fall through different mechanisms. And let me just quickly go over this because we don't have time. But here's what I want to focus on. Scholars have studied this, and their focus has been what is associated with these democratic crises. Really, when a president has to leave office for some reason other than an election, there's a crisis. And they have come up with this list, and I'm going to go over the list very quickly. But what I want you to notice is that it takes a lot to bring a government down. Normally, you need to see more than one crisis happening. So let me go over the possible crisis so that we get a sense for what scholars are being saying. Sometimes it is prompted by a constitutional crisis, a military crisis, some discontent at the level of the military, a major electoral defeat, or a major dispute about an election, an economic crisis, the government, the ruling party, becomes a minority in Congress, switches to being a minority. Street protests, I know that you cannot see this from back, so I apologize for that. Massive street protests, or finally, you see a big split at the top. The ruling party, the political party at the top, splits big time. And so these are the cases. The last example was Dilma Rousseff. In the case of Dilma, which was, she had an economic crisis, she had minority in Congress, she had street protests, and there was a bit of a split, not so much in the Labour Party. So this is kind of how it works. And so here I have Maduro. I know you cannot, those of you, but we'll see. And let me. So when you look at this, the first thing to keep in mind is you normally need more than one crisis. In fact, most of these cases occur when you have 3 or 4 or more. So it takes a lot. It takes a lot. Maduro in many ways has already met at least 4 of these conditions. Let me just quickly move forward and just show you. This is all data stuff that we don't need to worry about. But here, and I hope you can see it, this is the same chart, all the crises listed here. And here I'm comparing Maduro with Venezuelan interrupted presidents, just Venezuelans, not Latin Americans. So we have Chavez in 2002 when he briefly left office, Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1993, and the overthrow of Gallegos in 1948. And so, this is the analysis, and this is my view of Venezuela now. Definitely an electoral crisis. This is the heart of the problem, Chavismo no longer being competitive. The worst economic crisis, not just in the history of Venezuela, but probably in the world. There are economists who are saying that the kind of crisis that we're seeing in Venezuela is what you expect in countries that are undergoing savage civil war, because you have this combination of scarcity together with inflation, as well as complete collapse of the private as well as the public sector. Anyway, so you have an economic crisis of almost world record levels. It became a minority in Congress. This is the trauma of the Maduro administration after the 2015 legislative elections. And starting this year, again, the 4th cycle of massive protests, day 67. Last year, this would have been probably not marked as yes. So we have these 4 conditions. And a political scientist would say, all right, it's ready to fall, right? When I talk with Venezuelans, we start to talk about whether we should have more checks here. And, we could do it. Definitely one could say that all of them are checked, but the ones about which I don't think anybody would disagree are these 4, although we can add to the list. So what has the government done? What has the government done to make sure that these crises do not expand and to prevent these other crises from emerging or from staying contained? Let's go one by one, and then we can discuss them. I hope to take that in 7 more minutes, and then I think I'll be done. The constitutional crisis has been addressed by doing something inherited from Chavez, which is the Supreme Court has become a branch of the executive branch. This is a major violation of liberal democracy. The Supreme Court in every democracy has to be an independent and separate power. You might have seen this picture. Have you guys seen this picture?
Oh, yes.
It is such a good symbol of a real aberration in democracy. What you have are the Supreme Court justices of Venezuela, and circle the one who doesn't belong. There he is. Who is he? He's none other than the vice president, someone who is directly appointed by the president. And so it's a good image of the extent to which the Supreme Court has become merged with the executive branch. So we will never see a Supreme Court in Venezuela triggering a constitutional crisis. A constitutional crisis occurs when a court declares that something that the executive branch wants to do is unconstitutional and the president refuses to back down. Well, the court is never going to say that something that the president is unconstitutional. So that crisis has been avoided by way of this major violation of democratic principle. Why is there not so much discontent in the military? Although there is some, but the way that the government has dealt with it is borrowing directly from Cuba. The Venezuelan administration under Maduro, far more than Chavez, has basically given over public and private affairs to the military. Public, the running of the public sector, and private affairs, the conduct of the economy, both the legal and the illegal. So the military has now become the institution that will suffer the most if there's regime change, because they are the most important actor. And this militarization has proven enormously effective. How have they, this is a nice picture that shows really, the other picture was the judicial shield, this is the military shield. Just images, because I think they say so much. Yes. Let's talk about really the most dramatic transformation in Venezuelan politics. Remember, from 1998 up until 2013, the consistent story in Venezuela was that Chavismo was the majority in election time. This ended in 2013 and has gotten worse. All democracies, all political parties in democracies have to be prepared to not be in majorities. This is part of the cycle. But in Venezuela, the ruling party cannot deal with this. For them, it's a crisis. They refuse to accept something that needs to happen to every political force in every democracy in the world. What have they done? They have suspended every electoral process. This is the series of steps that has gotten Venezuela in most trouble internationally. Let me just give you an idea of the elections that in 2016 have been suspended officially by the government. The remake of the legislative elections in the Amazonas state, which would determine how much control of the opposition, how much control of the Congress the opposition has. The recall referendum, completely rejected. The election for governors, the election for local councils and subnational governments. And now the latest is the Constitution requires that if you're going to have a new constituent assembly, you first have to check with the people if they want to do it. That has been suspended as well. So, you know, we're talking about 5 seriously important elections, all constitutionally mandated, absolutely denied by the government. This places the government at the level of violating minimal democracy, because now we are in a place where you're not just cheating in elections, but you are simply not running them. The economic crisis, this, you know, requires a whole day, and I'm only going to do a brief. How is it that this government is surviving this sinking of the Titanic? Well, what has happened, and I'm going to try to go through this very quickly, is something that political scientists would describe selective protection. The government, facing fewer resources, fewer dollars, have decided to deny dollars to the private sector, see if in the process the private sector gets completely killed, and this is what's producing scarcity. But it is reserving enough dollars to the public sector and the military and a few close groups. This is called protecting your selectorate, the select group of actors that are key to your survival, and that group you insulate from the worst of the crisis. And the way that in Venezuela you get insulated is you get access to dollars, and you also receive enormous impunity to act. This is what the Maduro administration has done. For the sake of time, I'm not going to give you a perfect visual that I have to illustrate this. Just very quickly, let me show it to you, but I don't have time to go over it.
You have time.
How much more?
You have 15 minutes more.
15?
Yeah, 15.
Okay.
We can negotiate.
No. We have a great speaker coming up, and all right. Well, let me show you this. This is an amazing graph. Let's talk about it. It comes from Barclays, which is a bank that analyzes Venezuela's debt. This was done in 2015. I now have the data for more recent years, but the picture hasn't changed that much. So let's use the 2015 data. They were able to obtain data on how many dollars Venezuela receives, and they compare it from 2011 to 2015. And so this is the picture of Venezuela's massive external shock. In 2011, it was receiving this level of foreign currency, and by 2015 it was reduced by half. No doubt about it, this is a terrible externally produced shock. What is amazing about this chart is that we know how those dollars that are coming in, those petrodollars, are being distributed. First, the spending side. Notice that Chavismo has always overspent in good times and in bad times. 2011 was good time, they spent more dollars that were coming in. And when time came to make an adjustment, they made the adjustment, but they still spent at the deficit level. That is why there is inflation in Venezuela, persistent inflation, because there has been an adjustment, but not enough to reduce the deficit. There you have it. The answer to the biggest question, which why do you have inflation? There has been an adjustment, but not enough to eliminate the need to cover the deficit. And then there is data on where those dollars are going. And notice, and this is the distinction between the private sector and the public sector. For the private sector, you have seen a remarkable contraction of dollars. Here's the adjustment. This is the Greek type of austerity program directed at the private sector. This is the explanation for scarcity in Venezuela, right here. When you don't provide dollars to the private sector, you basically curtail the ability of the private sector to produce or even import. And here you have the inflation and scarcity. But take a look at the public sector. The public sector is actually receiving more dollars than during the good times. This is like remarkable. From an economic point of view, makes no sense. From a political point of view, the logic is this theory I discussed of protecting this electorate. Whoever has close ties to the public sector, that includes the military, but not just the military, has been insulated from the adjustment. Really remarkable. And of course the debt service that, you guys have, I don't know if you've read the hunger bonds and all the controversy about Venezuela not failing to meet its debt obligations. So you can see how they continue to devote dollars for that. All right, moving on. So that's the point about this is my guess of how the government is surviving this economic crisis. This is exactly what a democracy exists to prevent. You see this level of economic mismanagement, biased mismanagement, and you would expect a decline in electoral support, which is exactly what has happened in Venezuela. But you can deploy mechanisms for to contain it. Now, let's talk a little bit about, where is it? Oh, well, I wasn't able to have it, but this is the famous Dollar Today app on your, this is from my own iPhone actually, and this is from, what's the date? I think this was from a couple, 6 or 7, June 1st. And here is the different exchange rates in Venezuela. You cannot read it, but here's the thing to keep in mind. The unofficial exchange rate is, give me 6,000 bolivares and I'll give you $1. You give me 6,000, I'll give you $1. That's informal markets. But the official exchange rate that the government still respects is, give me 10 bolivares and I will give you $1. It hasn't been abolished. All economists are like, this is one of the most remarkable areas of corruption, but also political cooptation. Imagine to go to a government agency and get, with only 10 bolivars, which we know counts for nothing, and get $1. It's an enormous, enormous subsidy to a select few of people, those who are who have access to that exchange rate. So again, the idea is you insulate some groups from the worst of the crisis. Okay, moving on. No more about the corruption. Minority in Congress. The decline in electoral competitiveness produced a change in Congress. The Constitution requires the executive branch to respect the legislative role of the Congress. this is a major inconvenience for the administration. Solution, let's have a new constitution. Let's change the constitution so that we can change the rules through which the executive branch interacts with the other branches of government. There you have it. This is what this is entirely about. It's an effort to try to, I mean, look, the most important role of constitutions in a democracy is, of course, to give us rights. Yes, give us rights, but no. The most important thing is to tell the government what it cannot do, to create limits on the executive branch. And some constitutions give more permission to the executive branch than others. The Maduro administration wants to lessen the checks and balances on the executive branch, and this is the obvious intention with the Constituent Assembly from my point of view. There he is, President Maduro, from May 23rd, when he came up with the idea of a Constituent Assembly. This Constituent Assembly project isn't going that well, and I'll give you, in a second, I'll tell you why it's not going so well as the government had planned, but this is the tactic. Street protests, fourth cycle of street protests, and all I can say is, and I think what the images that we saw in the very beginning point to, the level of repression that we're seeing in Venezuela is definitely, of course, it's not genocide, it's not terror, but for Venezuelan standards, it's the most significant degree of repression that this country has seen, even when it was under authoritarian governments. We're seeing, one of the interesting things about Venezuela is that you have the National Guard repressing publicly, but what the pictures cannot convey is the role of colectivos. For those of you who are not aware of the term, colectivos was an invention by Hugo Chavez. There you have a picture from 2008, mobilized by the government, and these are people, civilians, who are given free rein, a blank check by the state to do the dirty work that needs to be done, to bully on behalf of the state. And a lot of what's happening now is that Maduro continues to rely on these folks, and they are completely unaccountable. And so you have the combination of the National Guard with this. 67 people have been killed, people have been arrested in large numbers. Many of them have been arrested at their homes, which if you're, this is odd, it's okay to arrest people in the streets if you're trying to stop street protests, but to do house arrest is a different level of terror. People who are being arrested are being tried in military tribunals, and this is going to have a chilling effect. Absolutely. This works. Repression does the job. The Venezuelan opposition is not an armed opposition. It's not a fighting machine. And so this level of repression has an advantage over this kind of opposition. If it were a guerrilla, it would probably have no impact. But because the opposition in Venezuela is still not a professionally armed group, the repression can work. Now, let me skip this because it's really, this is too much. Sorry. Let me get to one of the most debatable issues now is, are we finally seeing a split at the PSUV, the ruling party? I personally think that this is the key issue. That the moment that we see a real split among the civilians at the top, at the leadership, we are going to be closer to a moment in which they can say, let's get Maduro out in order to make Chavismo survive. So I think it's important that we pay attention to this variable, even if we're not sure at the moment how to score this variable. Are we observing a real ruling party split? When I was saying that the Constitution isn't, the Constituent Assembly project isn't working out for the Maduro administration, the reason I was saying this is because this is the first thing that Maduro has done that has produced public displays of criticisms by leading figures of Chavismo. Unfortunately, only one official has joined this side, Luisa Ortega. I would like to see other members of the cabinet, other members of the military. But aside from that, in sort of like the Chavista intelligentsia, there is quite a bit of unease about the Constituent Assembly. I don't know what's going to happen to this, but this is really one of the most promising signs that I have seen personally of the beginning of a change. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to become of this. I don't know whether this is the beginning of a break at the top. How Maduro is going to be able... He thought the Constituent Assembly idea was going to rally the Chavistas behind him, and it is doing some of that among some of them, but not all of them. I don't know what's going to happen to this, but it's definitely the thing to watch. Now, to conclude, let me just skip this one. To conclude, here are the crises. And again, we can have more yeses here if you want to. I'm happy to add them. But here's the response. This is sort of like my assessment of what living under Maduro is like. It's a government that is sinking as a result of crisis, but it has deployed a set of tools, all of which, in my opinion, violate important aspects of democracy, that are providing the government with a lifeline of sorts, some support. But the one thing you won't hear me say is that there is any semblance of democracy in this country. There was a time when I could say some democratic institutions, some democratic practices were still alive, but by now, the key point is that my answer to why is it that one of the most brutal crises in the history of humanity hasn't brought this government down is because the government has responded through really non-liberal autocratic responses. Those were my comments. So thank you for giving me extra time.
Thank you, Dr. Corrales. It's really interesting. We will open the sessions of questions and answers. I don't know if you want to continue there or stand here. I would like
the Q&A now?
we are having the sessions now.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'll just...
And I would like you, if you have questions, please say your name. Maybe the institution you represent or from which university you are coming. And we would like to know what we would like to ask. So, you have our first question. So stand up and say your name. Can you stand up? Oh yeah, so we can see you.
My name is Milagros Maldonado. I live in Holland 30 years, and I run the Organization for Latin American People in the Netherlands, Centro Latinoamericana de Orientación. I really want to congratulate Professor Corrales because so easy to understand and so clear. They're really amazing, especially when you are scientific outside the country, outside Venezuela, and you are not living the day-to-day crisis in the country. Really, it's very clear the information you gave it to us, and it's been really impressive. My question is, how to relate this situation, this conjunctural situation with the alimentation crisis at the moment and the medical problems, because this is a very political and sociological, but the day-to-day problem is arising in this moment very hard to the Venezuelan family, and now it's a desperate situation. And now that's why the street fights are increasing because it's a combination between political feeling and a social hunger at the moment. No? And it is an extra issue, or it is considered already in your presentation?
Yeah. Do you want me to?
Yeah, please.
Sure. The food and medicine crisis in Venezuela is really out of this world. When Latin American countries in the 1980s were having high inflation and the debt crisis, there was no food shortages. Food was expensive, but there was, complete lack of food. And also this medicine crisis. This is the reason why a lot of people who know about this stuff are calling this a humanitarian crisis. It's an easy crisis to solve. This is what makes it so sad. The food and medicine crisis can be solved not just with foreign aid, but essentially, let's take a look at the food crisis. You have a lot of people who are hungry, and so in any marketing textbook they would say this is a significant degree of demand. All you have to do is liberalize markets, and firms and sectors would step up to meet this demand because you have this demand. But the government refuses to lift the price controls that are preventing the domestic sector from meeting it. And the medicine crisis is the result of no dollars, not giving dollars to the private sector and doctors and the hospitals. It is horrible. I worry that, it's very difficult to sustain political protest when the population is starving. This is the drama. Or when the population is so afraid of getting sick or having a medical issue. Sometimes I wonder if the government is doing this deliberately. That is a way to weaken the resistance. Let's starve them. Let's make them think that if they get hurt, they're not going to get medical care. Maybe, I don't know, at this point. The reason I think I say that is because it's an easy crisis to solve. The medical crisis could be solved with humanitarian aid, which is ready to go in, and the government refuses. So that's all I can say about a real tragedy.
We can say that the part of the food and medicines crisis can go into the economic crisis altogether.
Right.
There. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
It is included there.
Yeah, and absolutely.
Yeah, that's the answer for you. Rodrigo.
Yeah. Yeah, my name is Rodrigo Toro. I'm a mechanical engineer working here in the Netherlands, Venezuela as well. I have my view, but I really like the way that you systematically show. I totally agree with that. There's one more that I have my view about how the country itself is ring-fenced with the United Nations, with the OAS, because there still have to be like a mechanism to control a few countries that give the vote. That's why Venezuela hasn't been openly seen as a dictatorship. There's still a lot of countries voting in favor of Venezuela or not voting just to protect them. I think it's because of the oil, but what is your view about it? How is Venezuela ring-fencing themselves to not everybody see it's a dictatorship?
5 years ago, the Venezuelan government essentially had complete diplomatic immunity. There were very few countries in the Western Hemisphere eager to put pressure on Maduro or Chavez. The good news is that this has changed. Finally, starting with Almagro at the OAS, but now with many other countries, we're starting to see countries that are would like to pressure Venezuela. It's a real turnaround. It started with Mexico and Colombia, actually, but it has expanded. And so that's the very good news. But as per my count, there are about 20 countries that want to put more pressure on the opposition than on the government. That includes about 16 Central American and Caribbean countries. They're the ones who say, oh, there has to be a dialogue. That's pressure on the opposition, not on the government. So, so why do they still, Petrocaribe was very important for Central America and the Caribbean, absolutely. So there's that. But let me say one more thing. The charter, the Democratic Charter of the OAS, which is an amazing document in the history of democracy of the Americas, should be invoked to do something about Venezuela. But in practice, what the members of the OAS are the way that they're treating the charter is, we will only invoke this charter if the threat to democracy comes from outside the state. So it is becoming more of a protection of incumbents than of democracy. And so it's very difficult to, and in many ways, because the OAS is run by presidents who also would not like to see the OAS ever challenging them. So the OAS doesn't really have an incentive to give a lot of teeth to a mechanism that would punish incumbents. So there's this dilemma at the OAS. I don't think that international pressure is going to determine the game here. I don't think that there's talk in the United States about an embargo, the Trump administration. I personally think that that would be incredibly counterproductive. We know from studying other embargoes, I mean, we as political scientists know that embargoes only work when the target state wants to have good relations with the United States. When they don't want to have good relations with the United States, they convert them into more justification for their craziness. So there is the possibility that the United States could take a stronger, harder line, but I think that that would be a mistake. It might happen, and we can talk about the probabilities. Why would Trump do this? This course of action was rejected by Bush, the entire Obama years. Now we're going to see whether Trump is going to continue with, was going to adopt them or not. But I'm a little nervous about thinking that all you need is a little bit of an extra push by an external actor. Currently, we know this. China, Russia, Cuba, and Goldman Sachs are supporting the Venezuelan government. So Venezuela is not alone internationally, not yet. So I wouldn't place my hopes on diplomatic effort to settle the crisis, unfortunately.
We have another question here. Sorry.
My name is Sterling. I study safety and security management at the Hayes University of Applied Sciences. I'd like to thank you on your presentation. It was great. I have a short question. You just mentioned it. Goldman Sachs invested $2.5 billion in cheap Venezuelan government bonds. What do you think personally are the implications of this? Thank you.
Well, first, here you have a government that is accusing the opposition of being capitalist, oligopolist, siding with imperialists. And it has been the Venezuelan opposition that has launched one of the most successful shaming campaigns of a capitalist operation that I have seen. So it's really remarkable, just that paradox that I was pretty surprised at how effective the opposition was able to shame Goldman Sachs for doing something that is not that market unexplainable. Now, and point number two, what a tragedy this is for Venezuela, because what is happening is that Venezuela is committing to service a debt that is so much greater than it needs to be. And in any other administration, this would be considered, the moral actor here is not Goldman Sachs, but the government of Venezuela selling debt at this level, this cheap, and with these, for the first 2 years, they're not going to have to service the debt for too much. But I think after year 3, the interest is going to be insane. So this is, I think, we should be directing moral repulsion at the government. But the government needs dollars desperately. I think the fact that the Venezuelan government is willing to sign such a bad deal tells you how economically sort of like choking they feel. But it's really remarkable how desperate the Venezuelan government has to be feeling economically.
Yeah, my name is Anita Bruce. I'm part of the platform the Venezuelan Union in Holanda. I have a question, Javier, similar than the previous one about the international community. Seeing all these figures, for me it's difficult to understand, and I want to know your thought. Why, besides Latin America and Caribbean, the rest of the world, European democratic countries, have so many problems to publicly ban some members of the government? Like Netherlands, for example, we have from the parliament, your parliament, you have a lot of, you hear some statements that specific governments are very resistant to make public declaration against the Venezuelan government. Why do you think that is happening now?
Let me, this is a very complicated question. I think the answer has something to do with Venezuela in particular, but also global politics in general. Let me start with the global politics. I think the era of Western democracies feeling like they should walk around ranking countries for governance violations and pushing them to behave better is over. I think this was a great moment in history in the 90s, into the 2000s, but it's over. The great powers are not interested in it. The small powers have so many problems of their own. They feel like it's not their place to be ranking other countries when they themselves have problems. So I think we're in this era. That era existed. I grew up in that era. I grew up in fact, if we had not had the era of Western nations interested in the international promotion of democracy, I'm not sure that America would have had its transition to democracy in the 1980s and 90s, because a lot of that process was the result of international actors forcing governments and even opposition forces to behave democratically and to punish them if they didn't. But I think that has ended. It has definitely ended with the United States, but not just with Trump, absolutely, but even before. Now, the issue with Venezuela is there are many Western nations that have enormous businesses in Venezuela still and hoping to get business. The Netherlands is one of them. They are parked. They are sort of like waiting. They don't want to be expelled from Venezuela. They're not making money. I don't necessarily think that they're protecting their profits. They're protecting their parking spot. And so this produces this hesitation. Having said that, you guys remember, maybe some of you know the story, the Netherlands was involved in a really polemical international decision with Hugo Carvajal. Remember the story? I have, Aruba was ready to extradite this individual to the United States to face charges of corruption, and the Netherlands intervened to block this extradition. I have asked everybody here what was the reason, and nobody tells me. I don't know. I've asked people here in The Hague. But it goes to show that I think they're protecting their parking spots. I understand that the Netherlands, just to give you an example, has about 14 to 15 major corporations, and they don't want to, they're too afraid, I think. When Venezuela was booming with petrodollars, the answer was obvious. The answer was, everybody's, making a lot of money with Venezuela, are either receiving petrodollars or selling stuff to Venezuela. But those days are over, and yet you see this hesitancy to batten off the government, and I think it's this combination of global politics and parking spots.
One more question.
My name is Osvaldo Molina, and I've been living here for 5 years already, and I lived in Aruba earlier for another 11 years. And I work in the kitchen, I'm a chef. But I'm one more of the worried Venezuelans living abroad. But after you see all that's happening in Venezuela, such a beautiful and rich country, being ravaged by the dictatorship in turn, especially. I want to tell you that your presentation was clear as water, and it was excellent, even though you didn't go in depth in each chapter because of time. I understand that, but it was very nice. I have a question. Well, I would like to tell you something about Carvajal. Why happened what happened? There was like 4 billion euros in businesses going from between Holland and Venezuela at that time. I think it was helicopters or something like that, or some tanks or something, but it was related to arms being bought to Holland. Anyhow, my question is, given that all these decisions, economical decisions being taken by the dictators or the dictatorship, is it possible for, I'm looking further in the future, is it possible for the next Venezuelan democratic government to say, we're not paying Goldman Sachs, we're not paying anybody, because this was done without the, let's say, the approval of the Congress? How can that be? How can these countries or these powerful banks or companies or whatever do business with dictators? And knowing that it's for inhuman goals, or the money is going to be used, of course, to buy tear gas, weapons, and everything that they can buy, even food for their sectorial parties. So how can this go on? And after this is over, is it possible or legal or well seen or just accepted? Is it going to be accepted that the future Venezuelan government will say, we're not paying for this for this debt? It's impossible for us to accept this debt. That's my question, and thank you very much for your presentation.
It wouldn't be inconceivable for democratic governments emerging from authoritarian regimes to repudiate that kind of debt. It happens. It is very risky to do it, because then private investors basically block you from international markets, and so it carries a huge risk to be that cocky. But it has been done. It could be done. I think the best energy would be to create a coalition of governments and the IMF to help you restructure the debt, to give you a lot of short-term aid. I think that would be the way to do it. And I think if they wanted to do that, if Venezuela wanted to do that, it would have no problem raising money, because Venezuela has a remarkable thing to offer international investors, and that is, I didn't talk about the worst mistake of Hugo Chavez, which is to allow PDVSA to collapse. The turnaround of PDVSA can be done in about a year. And in about a year, PDVSA can begin to generate dollars, the industry can recover, and this is amazing, the fact that PDVSA is in such shambles will give a future government in Venezuela enormous international leverage because it is an easy to reverse crisis. Fixing the price distortions is complicated, but fixing the collapse of the oil sector in Venezuela is very easy. The laws are perfect. The laws in Venezuela are perfect because the laws in Venezuela allow you to bring in a lot of foreign investment. And so I think that a non-authoritarian or post-authoritarian democratic government will have international leverage economically to avoid doing sort of like the most drastic thing of defaulting big time. But we'll see, I'm not an economist and I don't do those negotiations, but I think Venezuela's economic future is not that hopeless. And that Venezuela can do a lot to attract new money and better money.
I think it was one last question. This is
Yeah.
the last question because we need to go to a break. Please. Yeah.
I am Raúl Esteves.
Raúl
I
Esteves.
live actually in Venezuela. I am professor at the University of Los Andes in Mérida, Venezuela, and just visiting my son who lives here in Amsterdam. They came some 2 weeks ago. Our lives in the last 2 months have changed dramatically, our personal life. Our routine every day. We wake up and ask, okay, what is the protest today? And we prepare, go to the protest, spend half day there among these tear gases and bullets, and come back home, discuss what happened, and prepare for tomorrow, next day. Nobody's working, nobody's doing the level. It's impossible. Not only because you don't feel like doing it, but it's impossible because all the traffic, all the roads are closed. We can't move from one place to another. And for me, it's a big surprise how people are reacting. The most the repression, the most people goes out to the streets. And when I say they go out, I'm talking about 100,000 people in Caracas, for example. In Mérida, which is a very small university town, which every day you get thousands, 10,000, 20, 30,000 people on the street fighting against the police face to face, practically. And with every day this thing is increasing. So we have heard a lot of analysis and diagnosis of why this is happening. And the big question is how this thing is going to end. Because we are sort of locked in this game. The people are really decided to fight to the end. And the government and the militaries, they are ready to repress up to the end. Among other things, because they have no options. Okay, they can go to another place, they cannot spend their money, they steal. So how this thing will end? I would like to know what is your personal feeling about how this thing should end and how this thing may end. I don't know if you make the difference. What is the expectative, the good expectative of how this thing should end, and what is the bad news? What are the bad news?
All right. Glass of water.
I don't think I can offer a confident scenario one way or the other. I agree with you that the extent to which the protests have survived and expanded in this particular cycle are shocking. This is not what we have seen in Venezuela. So is this a Venezuelan spring of sorts, to talk about the Arab Spring? I read a study on what determined whether an Arab Spring, when they were happening, would succeed in toppling the government or not. And one of the studies I said is when the repression got to be serious, was there a split in the military? Not did the military, a little bit of what happened in 2002 in Venezuela, where the military would tell the president, we're not repressing anymore. And that is what determined the outcome of this war. If that is the case, the thing to reflect about is the opposition providing enough incentives for the military to abandon the government? This is a morally very difficult question. You know, we call this transitional justice, that as hard as it may sound, it comes a time when the worst perpetrators of human rights violations need some kind of dispensation, some kind of, they need to feel that abandoning and going to the other side, they're going to be okay and safe and protected. And I don't know whether the opposition is playing that game well or not. Historically, the Venezuelan opposition has played the game of mobilizing people to vote. That game has ended. The electoral game has ended. Now it's the question of persuading some of the nastiest elements of the regime to abandon Maduro. I don't know. The government has an easy way out of this. If the government, if Venezuela is the government is lucky that if Maduro resigns, they don't have to call for an election. The Constitution says, the vice president takes over and there's an election. So it should be easier at this point to see members of the ruling party saying, okay, Maduro, get out of the way, let us handle this, because unlike Brazil, when they got rid of Rousseff, the government switched parties. It went to a different party with the vice president, but that's not a problem in Venezuela. So what's keeping so many more Chavistas from, and especially the military, I think is the question for us to think about it. If this is the factor that will settle this war and produce a victory for the opposition. One other outcome is that Venezuela settles into an unstable dictatorship. When Chavez was around, we needed an adjective to talk about that kind of democracy, semi-authoritarian, hybrid regime, competitive authoritarianism. It could very well be that Venezuela will be, for a long time, an unstable dictatorship, a dictatorship that is constantly putting out fires. That's a possibility. Shockingly, and it'll mean the complete ruin of the country, because as you were saying, there's no work in an unstable dictatorship or in any situation of instability, but that's a possibility. I know this wasn't as satisfying as a 100% confident answer, but that's my best attempt at giving you some of my ideas. Okay. Great.
Thank you. Thank you
All right.
very much.
Thank you all.